under a cold and stubbornly gray London sky, the kind that makes the city feel like it's holding its breath. The gates of Buckingham Palace stood silent and imposing. Tourists lingered at a distance, snapping pictures, their chatter low, almost reverent. But among the crowd, there was a stir. Heads turned, cameras lifted, and there he was, Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, moving with a determined but visibly unsettled stride toward the palace entrance. His hair was slightly disheveled, his jacket unbuttoned, and his eyes, red-rimmed, restless, darted between the looming facade of his former home and the security guards already stepping forward. It had been years since Harry had approached Buckingham Palace uninvited. Years since he had stood on those polished stones without the shelter of an official engagement, a scheduled meeting, or the protection of his once unshakable royal role. But this time, there was no ceremonial welcome, no uniformed aide waiting to escort him in. This was different. This was personal, and the tension hung heavy in the winter air. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The guards recognized him instantly, of course. Everyone in that palace did. But recognition did not guarantee entry, not anymore. Their posture was formal, their expressions unreadable, but there was no mistaking the flicker of unease. For Harry to appear here, in this way, without warning, it meant something had gone terribly wrong. For months, whispers had been spreading in both the British press and Hollywood gossip circles. Rumors of financial strain, soured business deals, and growing unease in Montecito. The lucrative Netflix and Spotify partnerships that had once promised to secure Harry and Meghan's independence seemed to be faltering. Public appearances had grown fewer, the once relentless PR machine quieter. And now here was Harry, standing before the gates of the very institution he had once fought to break away from, ready to cross the threshold he had sworn he no longer needed. A black SUV was idling nearby, likely his transport from the airport. No official convoy, no royal escort. It was a detail the paparazzi would latch onto within hours. The man who had once ridden in armored Range Rovers bearing the royal crest now arrived like any other private citizen. And yet, he was anything but. Harry's presence at the palace that day was not ceremonial. He wasn't there for duty, or honor, or the pageantry that once defined his life. He was there for a reason that, to some, would be shocking, to others, inevitable. He had come to speak to his father, King Charles III, in person. He had come, according to palace insiders who would later leak the details, to ask for money. The weeks leading up to this moment had been turbulent. Friends had noticed his increasingly tense demeanor in private gatherings. His usual humor seemed dulled. Meghan's social circle in California had grown quieter, her appearances more curated, her smile more guarded. In their Montecito mansion, a place that had once symbolized their freedom from royal constraints, late-night conversations reportedly turned into debates about income, projects, and the dwindling goodwill of their global audience. The Sussex brand was still powerful, yes, but cracks were showing. And for a couple whose independence had been built on high-profile deals, the stakes were enormous. What's more, the dynamic between Harry and his father had shifted dramatically since the Queen's passing. Charles, now wearing the crown, carried the full weight of the monarchy on his shoulders. His decisions weren't just personal anymore, they were political. Every move was scrutinized not only for its family implications, but for how it reflected on the crown itself. Which is why this meeting, unscheduled, urgent, face-to-face, was both risky and telling. There had been letters before, messages through aides, even a phone call or two, though these conversations were brief, formal, and strained. But Harry believed, perhaps against his better judgment, that standing before his father in person would make a difference, that the king, confronted with his own son's vulnerability, would find it in his heart to extend a helping hand. Inside the palace, the corridors were not humming with the usual anticipation that came before a royal audience. This was no state affair. Those who had been alerted to Harry's arrival knew to keep their distance. Even for a family as practiced in keeping its emotions buried beneath protocol, the tension was palpable. When Harry finally crossed through the gates, escorted by 2 security officers, the sound of camera shutters behind him was relentless. The press didn't know the full story yet, but they knew enough to sense it was significant. The photos would be on every front page by nightfall. Harry walking alone, head slightly bowed, a faint shadow of unease on his face. Inside, he was led toward one of the smaller reception rooms, the kind used for discreet meetings away from the main ceremonial halls. It was here that King Charles, dressed not in regal finery but in a tailored gray suit, awaited. The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of a clock on the mantel. When father and son locked eyes, there was no warm embrace, no easy smile, just a heavy pause, filled with everything unsaid over the past several years. Harry spoke first, his voice low but urgent. Whatever words he chose, they carried the unmistakable weight of desperation. This wasn't about royal protocol, or titles, or public perception. This was about survival, financial, emotional, perhaps even reputational. For a man who had stepped away from the royal purse in the name of independence, it was a bitter reality to confront. Charles listened. He was known for his patience in conversation, for letting others speak before weighing in. But when he did respond, his words, though measured, landed with the finality of stone. He could not, he explained, offer the kind of support Harry was asking for. Not under these circumstances, not with the eyes of the world on them, and not with the precedent it would set. What happened in the minutes that followed would soon become the subject of endless speculation. Some would say Harry pleaded. Others would claim he grew angry, his voice rising in frustration. Palace aides would later admit that security had been instructed to remain nearby, in case the meeting became too heated. And though no one could confirm the exact details, what was clear was that the conversation ended abruptly, and not on good terms. When Harry left the room, he did not retrace his steps to the private wing or linger in the familiar halls. He was escorted directly toward the palace exit. Outside, the press was still waiting, the cold air biting at his face as he stepped back into the public eye. Cameras flashed. Questions were shouted. He didn't answer, but his silence spoke volumes. That image, Prince Harry, leaving Buckingham Palace with security at his side and no sign of reconciliation, would ignite a media storm. In the hours to come, commentators would dissect every angle of the story. Was this the final rupture between father and son? Had Harry's quest for independence backfired so severely that he was forced to return, hat in hand, to the family he had criticized so openly? Or was there more to the story, something deeper, more complex, that the headlines couldn't capture? Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. This was not just a private family dispute. This was a moment that would define the public's perception of Harry for years to come, and perhaps mark a point of no return for his relationship with the royal family. Harry's departure from the palace that day was not the quiet slipping away of a man who had simply dropped in for a polite visit. It was deliberate, brisk, and marked by the kind of body language that speaks louder than words. Shoulders set but slightly hunched, his gaze fixed ahead, not acknowledging the shouts of journalists calling his name, he walked the short distance from the palace doors to the waiting vehicle as if each step was heavier than the last. The sound of camera shutters followed him like a swarm, every flash capturing what the world would soon label as one of the most humiliating public moments of his post-royal life. Inside the palace, staff were already whispering. Some had served Harry since his childhood, remembering the young boy who had once darted through those very corridors in his school uniform, his laughter echoing against marble walls. Now, they watched the man he had become walk out of the building under very different circumstances. For many, it was a surreal and sobering sight, a reminder of how quickly royal relationships can fray when tradition, pride, and personal choices collide. The SUV door closed with a dull thud, muffling the chaos outside. Harry leaned back in his seat, jaw tight, the lines around his eyes deeper than they had been just a few years earlier. His driver avoided making eye contact in the rearview mirror, focusing instead on navigating away from the palace as swiftly as possible. The vehicle rolled past the iron gates, through the crowd, and into the streets of London, leaving behind the centuries-old institution that had been both his birthplace and, in his view, his prison. Newsrooms across the UK were already mobilizing. Producers scrambled to pull archive footage of Harry's happier days with the royal family, ready to contrast them with the raw, present-day images from outside the palace. Editors worked at a fever pitch, crafting headlines that would ensure clicks and views. Prince Harry turned away from Buckingham Palace. Royal reunion ends in rejection. begging for help? King Charles says no. The narrative was taking shape before the dust had even settled. Across the Atlantic, the story hit differently. In the United States, where Harry and Meghan had cultivated a brand rooted in independence, mental health advocacy, and philanthropic work, the idea of him returning to his father for financial support clashed with the carefully curated public image. The Sussexes' supporters rushed to defend them online, framing the visit as an attempt at reconciliation rather than desperation. But their critics seized on the opportunity to question everything: their wealth, their integrity, and their ability to sustain their lifestyle without royal backing. What few knew at that moment was just how precarious Harry's situation had become in recent months. The deals that had once seemed bulletproof were faltering. Negotiations with production companies dragged on without results. Projects announced with great fanfare quietly disappeared from streaming platforms' development slates. And as the Sussexes' relevance in entertainment began to wane, so too did their negotiating power. For all their public appearances and media interviews, income streams were not keeping pace with expenses. The private jet flights, the sprawling Montecito estate, the security detail, it all came at a staggering cost. It wasn't just about money, though. Pride played an enormous role in the tension between father and son. For Charles, granting Harry's request would send a message to the rest of the family and to the public that independence was negotiable, that one could renounce royal duties yet still draw on the monarchy's resources when times got tough. For Harry, returning to ask for help was an act that required swallowing years of resentment and public defiance. It was a gamble, a belief that blood ties might outweigh the damage done by interviews, memoirs, and pointed criticisms of the firm. But the gamble had failed. The king's refusal, though calm and polite on the surface, had been firm and final. He offered words about responsibility, self-reliance, and the need to move forward without leaning on the crown. To an outsider, it might have sounded like the kind of speech a father gives to encourage growth. But to Harry, standing there in that quiet reception room, it was a door being slammed shut, not just on financial help, but on any hope that their fractured relationship might be mended in the near future. As the SUV merged into the traffic and Buckingham Palace receded into the distance, Harry's mind must have been racing. There would be a call to Meghan, no doubt, perhaps already anticipated. There would be damage control to manage, statements to draft, allies to rally. Yet no matter how the story was spun, the truth was that he had gone to his father in need and left empty-handed. The optics alone would be brutal. In Montecito, Meghan's reaction would later be described by a source as a mix of fury and disbelief. She had supported the trip, perhaps even pushed for it, believing that face-to-face contact might pierce through the frostiness of their exchanges over the last few years. To hear that Harry had not only been denied but escorted out, and in view of photographers, was more than a setback. It was a humiliation, both personal and public. Meanwhile, royal watchers were already speculating about what this meant for the monarchy's image. Some praised Charles for holding firm, framing the decision as an act of leadership and financial prudence. Others criticized him for turning his back on his own son in a moment of vulnerability, warning that the public might see the monarchy as cold and unfeeling. The truth, as always with the royal family, was layered, political, and deeply personal all at once. And so the stage was set. One unscheduled visit, one closed-door conversation, and one very public exit had reignited a family drama that the world couldn't look away from. The questions now were endless. Would Harry and Charles speak again? Would this mark the point of no return in their relationship? Or would time, and perhaps necessity, bring them back together once more? The trouble didn't begin overnight. It had been building quietly for months, maybe even years, masked by polished interviews, charity appearances, and the sheen of celebrity life in California. But behind the scenes, Prince Harry's financial stability was beginning to slip. The once bottomless resources of royal life were gone, replaced by the unpredictable and often fickle world of commercial deals. The truth was, Harry had stepped out of the palace with the promise of freedom, but freedom came with bills that never stopped arriving. When Harry and Meghan left the royal family in early 2020, their exit was framed as a step toward independence, both emotional and financial. They would make their own money, live life on their terms, and no longer rely on the British taxpayer. At first, the plan seemed unstoppable. Within months, major platforms like Netflix and Spotify signed them to eye-watering deals. There were speaking engagements, media interviews, and the potential for book contracts. For a while, it looked like they had pulled off something extraordinary, leaving the firm and still living in luxury. But luxury in Montecito, California, was expensive in ways the couple may not have fully anticipated. Their estate, sprawling, secluded, and equipped with every high-end feature imaginable, came with annual costs in the millions. Property taxes alone were staggering. Add to that the maintenance of grounds, staff salaries, and the constant need for high-level security, and the numbers began to pile up quickly. The private flights to events and meetings, often chartered to avoid the press, carried five-figure price tags each time. Security was one of the biggest ongoing expenses. Having stepped away from royal duties, Harry no longer had access to the same taxpayer-funded protection he once did. In the United States, that meant paying for a private security team capable of handling the unique threats faced by a globally recognizable couple. Estimates placed those costs at several $million annually. Even with substantial earnings, that kind of financial burn rate could quickly become unsustainable if new income streams didn't keep pace. For a while, the couple relied heavily on the narrative of being sought-after public figures. Harry and Meghan's names could fill arenas, draw global media attention, and sell stories. But the entertainment industry has a short attention span, and by the time 2023 rolled around, cracks were showing. The podcast deal with Spotify ended abruptly, amid rumors of creative disagreements and disappointing results. Their Netflix projects, though still technically active, were not producing the steady flow of income they had anticipated. One project after another seemed to stall or face development changes. Harry's memoir, released to explosive headlines, had brought in a large payout. But book sales, no matter how successful, are a one-time windfall. The real challenge was creating sustainable income to match the scale of their spending. That challenge was proving harder than either of them expected. Hollywood executives and media producers, once eager to work with the Sussexes, were now weighing the risks and rewards more carefully. The novelty factor was wearing off. Behind closed doors, the pressure was mounting. Friends began to notice Harry's tone when money came up in conversation. Meghan, who had always been strategic about branding, was reportedly concerned about their public image being damaged if financial trouble leaked. In a world where perception often mattered as much as reality, the idea that they might be seen as struggling, even slightly, was unthinkable. Part of the difficulty came from the fact that their brand was built on exclusivity and aspiration. They couldn't easily scale down without it becoming obvious to the public. Selling the Montecito estate, downsizing security, or cutting back on travel would not just save money. It would signal to the world that the Sussex dream wasn't as untouchable as it had seemed. And so, month after month, the financial picture grew tighter. Harry began to feel the weight of it. For a man raised in an environment where money was an abstract concept, managed by others, always available when needed, the reality of budgeting, negotiating, and strategizing was a steep adjustment. The palace had once provided not just the resources, but the infrastructure to manage them. Now, every decision had to be made personally, and every consequence felt more immediate. It wasn't just the financial side that wore on Harry. The couple's public profile was tied directly to their ability to secure high-value projects. Every rejection, every delay, chipped away at the perception of their influence. Invitations to the most exclusive events were no longer guaranteed. Deals that had once been offered outright now came with negotiations, conditions, and performance expectations. By the time whispers began circulating about Harry considering reaching out to his father, the situation was more strained than most realized. It wasn't a matter of being on the verge of ruin. They were still wealthy by any ordinary standard, but the trajectory was troubling. The lifestyle they had built was dependent on a steady flow of high-value opportunities, and those opportunities were slowing. There was also the matter of legacy. Harry had spoken often about wanting to provide for his children independently of the royal system. Yet, here he was, looking at the very real possibility that he might have to return, at least temporarily, to the very system he had rejected. The irony was bitter. The turning point came after a series of private meetings with advisors in California. They laid out the numbers in stark terms: upcoming tax bills, property expenses, outstanding costs from security, and the unpredictable timeline for new earnings. Even the most optimistic projections couldn't erase the fact that, without a significant injection of cash, the next year would require serious changes. Harry's thoughts turned, reluctantly, to his father. He knew it was a gamble. Their relationship had been strained for years, the distance widened by public interviews and accusations. Yet, there was still a part of him that believed the bond between father and son might outweigh politics and pride. He told himself it was not about dependency. It was about a bridge, a short-term measure to buy time while new projects took shape. In the weeks leading up to his palace visit, Harry reached out in small ways. A message passed through an aide. A brief note sent to Charles's office. None of these attempts led to the kind of conversation he hoped for. Whether the king was avoiding the subject or simply too busy, Harry couldn't tell. But the lack of response left him with one conclusion. If he wanted to be heard, he would have to show up in person. It was a decision that carried risk on every level. If the meeting went badly, the rejection would be personal and deeply public. If it went well, there would still be the matter of how the arrangement might be perceived by the press. Harry understood that the palace operated as much on optics as on tradition. But in the end, the urgency of his situation outweighed the potential embarrassment. The trip to London was planned quietly. No fanfare, no press release, no coordinated schedule of appearances. Just a direct flight and a car arranged to take him from the airport to the palace gates. In his mind, he told himself this was simply a family matter. No cameras, no audience, just a conversation between father and son. He had no way of knowing how quickly that hope would unravel. When the deal with Netflix was first announced, it was heralded as a masterstroke. Harry and Meghan, barely a year removed from their explosive decision to step away from the royal family, had landed what the press described as a game-changing agreement with one of the world's most powerful streaming platforms. The reported figure, up to $100 million, sent shockwaves through both the entertainment industry and the royal watching world. For their supporters, it was proof that the Sussexes could thrive outside the gilded cage. For their critics, it was a dangerous sign that they were willing to trade royal dignity for Hollywood glamour. At the time, Netflix was at the peak of its global dominance. Original programming was driving massive subscriber growth, and the platform was pouring billions into content acquisition. They weren't just buying shows and films, they were buying cultural influence. Securing the Duke and Duchess of Sussex was a statement. A symbolic victory over traditional media, a way to capture headlines and pull in new audiences curious to see what this royal couple could create. The partnership was branded under their new company, Archwell Productions. The vision, as laid out in the press release, was to produce documentaries, docuseries, feature films, scripted shows, and children's programming, content that would inform, elevate, and inspire. It was ambitious. It was glossy. And on paper, it made perfect sense. But behind the polished announcements, the reality was far more complicated. The entertainment industry doesn't operate on goodwill alone. Multi-million-dollar deals are built on deliverables, deadlines, and market performance. And almost immediately after signing, Harry and Meghan faced the steep learning curve of creating high-quality, marketable content in a competitive field where reputations are earned, not inherited. The first project to gain traction was Harry and Meghan, the 6-part documentary series chronicling their relationship, royal struggles, and eventual break from the monarchy. It was a global event upon release, dominating headlines and topping Netflix's charts for a brief period. But its impact was mixed. While it drew millions of viewers, it also sparked a backlash. Critics accused the couple of oversharing, of framing themselves too heavily as victims, and of delivering more melodrama than substance. The series succeeded in getting attention, but it also reinforced polarizing public perceptions. In Hollywood, perception matters as much as performance. Executives began to wonder whether the Sussex brand, while powerful in generating headlines, was too divisive to guarantee consistent audience appeal. The metrics were telling. The initial episodes drew massive numbers, but viewership dropped sharply as the series progressed. That decline suggested that curiosity, rather than loyalty, was driving engagement. The second major project, the animated children's series, Pearl, was announced with excitement. It was to follow the adventures of a 12-year-old girl inspired by influential women from history. Meghan herself was deeply involved in the concept, and the project had the potential to be both uplifting and commercially viable. But in 2022, Netflix canceled Pearl before it even went into production. The official reason cited was cost-cutting, as the platform reevaluated its content slate amid subscriber losses. Industry insiders, however, whispered that the project lacked a clear creative direction and that Archwell Productions had struggled to meet development benchmarks. The cancellation was a blow, not just financially, but symbolically. Losing a project so early in its life cycle sent a message that Netflix might not be as committed to the Sussexes as the initial deal suggested. The press seized on the story, framing it as evidence that the couple's Hollywood ambitions were faltering. Behind the scenes, tensions reportedly grew between Archwell's team and Netflix executives. The platform wanted commercially viable, timely content that could compete with blockbuster releases and viral docuseries. Archwell, on the other hand, seemed more inclined toward carefully curated, socially conscious projects that required long development periods. The gap between the two visions created friction. Harry's personal project, Heart of Invictus, a documentary following competitors preparing for the Invictus Games, finally made it to the platform. It was well received critically, praised for its uplifting portrayal of wounded veterans and adaptive sports. But while the series earned respect, it did not generate the massive viewing numbers Netflix typically expects for marquee talent deals. For the executives responsible for justifying the investment, that mattered. By mid-2023, reports began circulating that Netflix's patience was wearing thin. The Sussexes had delivered 2 notable releases in as many years, but the output was far below what a 9-figure deal implied. And the industry climate had changed. Netflix was no longer in its spend-at-any-cost phase. Competition from Disney+, Apple TV+, and Amazon Prime Video meant that every high-profile partnership had to earn its keep. The problem for Harry and Meghan was that they were now in a different position than when they signed the deal. In 2020, they were fresh out of the royal household, with unprecedented public interest surrounding them. By 2023, that novelty had worn off. Viewers had heard their side of the royal story multiple times in multiple formats. What was left to offer? Internally, Archwell struggled with staffing changes and creative turnover. Several key hires left within a short span, citing differences in vision. Projects that were announced quietly faded from the slate. The lack of consistent output meant that Netflix was covering costs without seeing a steady return. The platform's executives began pushing for more commercially friendly projects, celebrity-driven features, reality content, or scripted dramas that could pull in broad audiences. Meghan, however, reportedly resisted the idea of producing content that felt too sensationalist or trivial. She wanted control over the tone and messaging, even if it meant slower development. This fundamental mismatch left both sides frustrated. The financial implications were real. While Netflix had paid out portions of the deal up front, the remaining sums were tied to milestones and project delivery. Delays meant delays in payment. For Harry and Meghan, who had factored this income into their long-term financial planning, the slowdown created a ripple effect. By the time 2024 rolled around, the whispers in industry circles were that the Netflix partnership was no longer guaranteed to last its full term. Executives spoke in careful terms about reassessing priorities and aligning creative direction. Those phrases, in Hollywood speak, often precede a quiet separation. For Harry, the stakes were personal. His connection to the Invictus Games meant that Heart of Invictus was more than just a content deliverable. It was part of his identity. Seeing it struggle to make a major commercial impact was a disappointment he felt deeply. For Meghan, the Netflix platform had represented a chance to shape global narratives on her terms. Losing momentum, there was a public and private setback. The trouble with the Netflix collapse was that it didn't just jeopardize one revenue stream. It signaled to other potential partners that the Sussexes might not be a safe bet. In the entertainment industry, perceived underperformance can lead to fewer offers, lower budgets, and shorter contracts. For a brand built on exclusivity and influence, that was dangerous. As Netflix cooled, the couple looked for other opportunities. But those deals, too, were taking longer to secure, and none offered the same combination of money and prestige. The gap between public image and private reality was widening, and Harry could feel the pressure mounting. In private conversations, he began to admit to confidants that the Netflix partnership wasn't delivering as expected. He worried aloud about the financial strain of maintaining their current lifestyle without a consistent influx of high-value deals. Each month brought more expenses, and while they were far from destitute, the margin for error was shrinking. The unraveling of the Netflix deal was not just a business issue. It was one of the catalysts that pushed Harry toward making that fateful trip back to Buckingham Palace. With one of his most significant financial lifelines fraying, the prospect of swallowing his pride and asking his father for help became less unthinkable. The stakes were no longer just about personal independence. They were about stability, survival, and the ability to protect the life he had built for his family. The Montecito estate, with its sweeping lawns, manicured hedges, and sprawling 16-bedroom layout, was supposed to be a sanctuary. Nestled in the quiet affluence of California's coastal hills, it was the embodiment of Harry and Meghan's new life. Free from royal protocol, insulated from the intrusive press, and surrounded by sunshine and privacy. On the surface, it looked like a dream realized. But inside those walls, the mood had shifted. By the time the troubles with Netflix began to take root, life in Montecito had taken on a different rhythm. There were still glamorous moments, charity galas, carefully staged interviews, and high-profile meetings, but those bright spots were spaced farther apart. More often, the days were marked by tense conversations behind closed doors, whispered strategy sessions in the study, and a growing undercurrent of unease. Friends who visited the estate noticed subtle changes. Meghan, once quick to fill a room with her energy and ideas, seemed more guarded. Her smile remained polished in public, but privately she was sharper, more analytical, almost as though she was scanning every detail for signs of weakness in their carefully constructed image. Harry, meanwhile, carried himself with a heaviness that hadn't been there before, a man wrestling with frustration and uncertainty, often retreating to quiet corners of the house to make hushed phone calls. The pressure was compounded by the fact that their lifestyle was inseparable from their public identity. Every element, from the private chefs to the team of security officers to the landscaped gardens, was part of the brand they had built. Scaling back wasn't as simple as cutting costs. It risked signaling vulnerability to a public that was always watching. In the world they occupied, perception could be as damaging as reality. The couple's inner circle was not blind to the financial strain. A few trusted friends broached the subject delicately, suggesting that perhaps they could streamline expenses, at least temporarily. But Meghan reportedly bristled at the idea. To her, appearances were everything. Pulling back would not just affect their comfort. It would send a message that the dream they had sold to the world was beginning to fray. It was in this climate that their private conversations began to take on a different tone. What had once been light brainstorming sessions about future projects now became more urgent debates. Meghan would scroll through her phone during dinner, checking updates from their agents, monitoring media coverage, and flagging potential opportunities. Harry, for his part, grew increasingly preoccupied with the question of sustainability, not just financially, but emotionally. How long could they keep this pace? How long before the cracks became too obvious to hide? One evening, over glasses of wine in the sitting room, the conversation turned to the past. Meghan asked, half seriously, whether Harry ever regretted leaving the royal family. The question hung in the air for a moment before he answered. He didn't regret the decision, he said, but he did miss the certainty, the knowledge that, no matter what storms came, the infrastructure of the monarchy would shield him from ruin. Out here, in the world they had chosen, there were no guarantees. It was during these late-night talks that the idea of reaching out to King Charles first surfaced. At the beginning, it was framed as a potential reconciliation gesture. Harry could make the trip, speak privately with his father, and perhaps open the door to repairing their fractured bond. But as their financial situation became clearer, the purpose of that visit shifted. It was no longer just about mending fences. It was about asking for help. Meghan was pragmatic about it. She understood the risks but believed that, handled correctly, the request could be framed as a family matter rather than a bailout. She argued that going in person would show sincerity, that a father might respond differently when looking into his son's eyes. But she also made it clear that the request had to be strategic, specific, reasonable, and positioned in a way that didn't undermine their narrative of independence. Harry, however, was conflicted. Pride and principle warred with practicality. Every fiber of his being resisted the idea of returning to the institution he had so publicly criticized, especially to ask for financial support. He worried about how it would look if the press found out. But the truth was, their options were narrowing. Between the slowdown in revenue and the constant outflow of expenses, the safety net was thinning faster than they liked to admit. The tension between them grew in subtle but telling ways. Meghan became more meticulous in her oversight of their joint ventures, sometimes challenging Harry's decisions with a bluntness that surprised even him. Harry, in turn, became more withdrawn in certain discussions, avoiding confrontation by deflecting to other topics. Neither of them was naive. They both knew that stress could erode even the strongest partnerships. But acknowledging the strain didn't make it any easier to bear. Behind the scenes, preparations for the potential trip to London began quietly. Meghan tapped into her network to gauge the mood within certain royal circles, hoping to find an intermediary who might soften Charles's reception. Harry spoke with a couple of longtime confidants, seeking advice on how to approach his father without provoking a defensive response. Each step was deliberate, aimed at minimizing the chance of public embarrassment. The stakes weren't just personal, they were existential for the brand they had built. A supportive meeting with the king could open doors, perhaps even lead to joint charitable initiatives that would reinforce their image as global humanitarians rather than estranged royals. A rejection, however, would risk cementing the narrative of isolation and failure. As the departure date neared, the atmosphere in Montecito grew taut. Meghan fussed over the optics, what Harry should wear, how he should carry himself, even the tone of his voice when making the request. She emphasized the importance of maintaining dignity, no matter the outcome. Harry, for his part, focused on rehearsing the key points he wanted to make, that he was not seeking a permanent return, that this was a temporary arrangement, that it was in the interest of preserving the broader family legacy. But beneath all the strategy and rehearsal, there was an undercurrent of something more fragile. A hope, however faint, that the visit might not just bring financial relief, but also a measure of personal healing. Harry missed the simpler moments with his father, before the interviews, the books, the accusations. Perhaps, in some small way, he hoped that showing up in person might remind Charles of the son he once knew. Yet, both of them understood the risk they were taking. In the world of royalty, private disputes rarely stayed private for long. And if this meeting went wrong, the fallout would be swift, public, and unforgiving. When the morning finally came for Harry to leave, the Montecito estate was unusually still. Meghan walked him to the waiting car, her expression unreadable but her grip on his hand firm. They exchanged a few quiet words, part encouragement, part instruction, before he stepped inside. The engine started, and the vehicle rolled down the long driveway, leaving behind the quiet opulence of the California hills for the gray uncertainty of London. What awaited him there would test not just his relationship with his father, but the delicate balance of pride, necessity, and the image he and Meghan had fought so hard to protect. Before Harry boarded a plane for London, before the unannounced walk to Buckingham Palace gates, there had been an attempt to bridge the divide in a way that felt safer, less confrontational. It had come in the form of a letter, handwritten, personal, and deliberate. The choice to write rather than call was not accidental. Phone calls between Harry and his father in recent years had been brief, stiff, and often awkward, with pauses so long they felt like silences filled with years of unresolved tension. A letter, Harry reasoned, could allow him to lay out his thoughts clearly, without interruption or the pressure of immediate reaction. He began drafting it in the quiet of his Montecito study one evening, the room lit only by a desk lamp. Outside the window, the California twilight was fading, the distant hum of the ocean just audible in the stillness. Meghan had retreated to another part of the house, giving him space. For Harry, the act of writing to his father was heavy with conflicting emotions, resentment over past grievances, a lingering hope for reconciliation, and a deep, unspoken fear that the request he was about to make might finally sever what little remained of their bond. The opening of the letter was careful, almost formal. He acknowledged the strain between them, referenced the differences in how they had each chosen to live their lives, and made an effort to avoid language that could be interpreted as accusatory. This was not the time for rehashing old wounds. His words moved quickly toward the present, the reality of his situation, the challenges of securing steady projects, and the pressures of maintaining both his family's safety and their public commitments. When he finally addressed the purpose of the letter, he did so with an emphasis on practicality. He was not, he wrote, asking for a permanent return to royal funding. Instead, he framed his request as a temporary measure, a bridge to cover certain pressing costs while new ventures solidified. He argued that their public image as a family would benefit from a show of unity, especially in the wake of recent media storms. In doing so, he tried to couch the request not as personal desperation, but as an opportunity for the monarchy to demonstrate compassion and stability. Harry was acutely aware that money was only part of what he was asking for. Implicit in the letter was a request for acknowledgement, for his father to see the weight he was carrying and to respond with understanding. There was a vulnerability in committing those words to paper. He knew that once sent, the letter would become part of the unspoken archive between them, something Charles could revisit, share, or even ignore. When the first draft was done, Harry read it aloud softly, gauging the tone. It felt too blunt in places, too formal in others. Over the next 2 days, he reworked it, softening certain phrases, removing any hint of entitlement, and adding a few personal touches, a memory of a family moment, a line about Archie and Lilibet that he hoped might evoke warmth. He signed it not with his formal title, but simply as Harry, hoping the simplicity would land as sincerity rather than informality. Meghan read the final version and approved of its balance. She suggested he send it through a secure, private courier rather than via email or palace channels, both to avoid leaks and to underline the seriousness of the gesture. The letter left Montecito within hours, its journey as discreet as possible. Weeks passed before a reply came. It arrived not as a letter in return, but through an intermediary, a senior aide at the palace who had known Harry since his youth. The message was polite but non-committal. The king had read the letter and would consider its contents. There was no timeline for a decision, no indication of whether the request was likely to be granted. Harry found the response frustrating in its vagueness. The fact that Charles hadn't written back personally stung more than he cared to admit. In his mind, a direct reply, even a refusal, would have felt more genuine than a carefully worded placeholder from a member of staff. Meghan tried to reassure him that the very act of not rejecting the request outright was a good sign, that perhaps the king was weighing how best to respond without creating political backlash. But as more days passed without further communication, Harry began to suspect that the hesitation was itself an answer. He knew how the palace operated. Delays could be strategic, a way to avoid saying no outright while letting the matter fade into the background. It was an old tactic, one he had seen used many times on other family disputes. The problem was, this wasn't an issue he could afford to let fade. He considered sending a second letter, something more urgent, but decided against it. Too many words on paper could be interpreted as pressure, and pressure could provoke a defensive reaction from Charles. Instead, he tried to reach his father through a phone call. The call went unanswered, and no message was returned. By this point, the strain in Montecito was palpable. Every day, without a response, made the air in the house feel tighter. Meghan began to push more openly for an in-person visit, arguing that Harry needed to break through the wall of palace formality and speak to Charles face-to-face. A letter could be filed away. A son standing in front of his father could not be ignored so easily. Harry wrestled with the decision. He knew that showing up unannounced could be seen as a breach of protocol, perhaps even a provocation. But the alternative, waiting in limbo while their financial situation worsened, felt like an even greater risk. The letter had been a cautious first move. Now, he felt, it was time for a bold one. Before leaving for London, Harry made one final attempt to follow up discreetly. He called the aide who had delivered Charles's initial acknowledgement and asked, plainly, whether his father intended to respond directly. The aide hesitated before saying that the king's schedule was exceptionally full in the coming weeks and that no meeting had been arranged. Harry thanked him curtly and ended the call, the decision now cemented in his mind. The letter had been his olive branch, his attempt at measured diplomacy. It had also been a test, to see whether his father would meet him halfway. In Harry's eyes, the silence that followed was a sign that halfway was not enough. If he wanted an answer, he would have to stand in the same room and ask for it. That choice would set the stage for what came next. The unannounced arrival at Buckingham Palace, the tense exchange with the king, and the moment that would ignite a storm of headlines across the globe. The silence that followed Harry's letter wasn't just an absence of communication. It was a living thing, a shadow in the room that neither he nor Meghan could ignore. Days became weeks, and each morning began with the same question from Meghan, "Any word?" and the same shake of Harry's head. At first, he tried to convince himself that the delay was due to the king's schedule. Charles was not only managing state affairs, but navigating a royal household that was in constant motion. But deep down, Harry knew that if his father had wanted to speak with him, a call could have been made in minutes. The letter had been crafted with care, delivered discreetly, and framed as a reasonable request. Still, the response had been little more than a polite deferral through a trusted aide. It wasn't the outright rejection Harry feared, but it was also far from the affirmation he had hoped for. That vagueness was worse in some ways. It left him suspended between optimism and resignation, unable to make decisions about what came next. Meghan, however, was not one to linger indefinitely in uncertainty. She had seen enough of royal politics to know that waiting on the palace's timeline was rarely in the petitioner's favor. In private conversations with Harry, she became more direct, even blunt. A letter could be ignored. An unreturned phone call could be brushed aside. But if Harry stood in front of his father, if they looked each other in the eye, there would be no buffer, no aid to act as a gatekeeper, no space for carefully worded evasions. The suggestion stirred something in Harry. For weeks, he had been playing by palace rules, approaching the matter with caution and restraint. And where had that gotten him? A vague acknowledgement, an unanswered call, and more times slipping away while their financial situation remained precarious. An in-person visit would break that stalemate. It would put the matter squarely before the king in a way that could not be quietly filed away. Yet the risks were undeniable. Buckingham Palace was not just a family home. It was the symbolic heart of the monarchy. Arriving without an appointment, especially after years of public estrangement, could be interpreted as a provocation. There was also the matter of optics. The media had eyes everywhere in London. If word got out, and it inevitably would, the visit would be spun in ways they couldn't control. Harry knew the headlines could be brutal. Prince begs for bailout. Harry returns hat in hand. Palace doors shut to Duke of Sussex. Still, the alternative was to continue waiting in limbo. And waiting carried its own dangers. Every month without a solution meant more pressure on their finances, more arguments behind closed doors, more quiet erosion of the image they had worked to build since stepping back from royal duties. The situation was not yet catastrophic, but the direction of travel was clear. In late winter, the decision was made. Harry would go. The trip would be unannounced to the public, but discreetly coordinated enough to ensure he could gain entry to the palace gates without causing a full-blown security incident. He would travel alone, both to reduce attention and to make the meeting feel less like a formal negotiation and more like a father and son conversation. The planning was careful but swift. Meghan insisted on certain preparations: the suit he would wear, the way he would carry himself, the precise language he would use when making his request. She reminded him that dignity mattered as much as the outcome. No matter what happened, the visit should project the image of a man acting out of responsibility, not desperation. Harry agreed, but privately he understood that desperation was, in truth, the quiet engine driving the decision. Before leaving, he made a few discreet calls to trusted contacts in London. These were not high-ranking courtiers, but individuals who knew the rhythms of the palace, the likely movements of the king, and the best times to attempt a private word. From them, Harry learned that Charles would be in residence for several days between engagements. It was as good an opening as he was likely to get. On the morning of his departure, Montecito was unusually quiet. The sun was just rising over the hills, casting the estate in gold. Meghan walked him to the waiting car, her hand lingering on his arm as they exchanged a few low words. She told him to remember the key points, to keep his emotions steady, and to frame the request as mutually beneficial, not just for him, but for the monarchy's image. Harry nodded, though he knew that once he was in the same room with his father, all rehearsed words might be swept aside by the raw weight of their history. The flight to London was long, giving him too much time to think. He stared out the window for hours, the clouds shifting beneath him, replaying old conversations with his father in his mind. Some were warm, filled with shared jokes and quiet understanding. Others were tense, marked by the clipped tones and careful pauses that had defined their relationship in recent years. He wondered which version of Charles he would encounter this time. When the plane touched down at Heathrow, the sky was low and heavy, the air damp with the hint of rain. Harry kept his head down as he moved through the terminal, accompanied by a single security aide. The drive into central London was quiet, the city moving around him as if unaware of the small storm that was about to break inside its most famous residence. Approaching Buckingham Palace from the Mall, Harry felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. The ornate gates, the grand facade, the guards in their crisp uniforms. All of it was steeped in memories, both cherished and bitter. He had not walked through those gates uninvited in years. The last time he had been here for anything approaching a private family matter had been under very different circumstances, before the chasm between him and the rest of the royal family had grown so wide. He stepped from the car and walked toward the gates, his pace measured, his eyes fixed ahead. The guards recognized him immediately, but their expressions remained neutral. One stepped forward, speaking quietly into a radio. Moments later, another guard approached, listening to instructions through an earpiece before nodding to Harry. He was permitted to enter. As he crossed the courtyard, the palace loomed above him, every window and archway a reminder of the life he had left behind. He was led through familiar corridors, the sound of his footsteps echoing off marble floors. The air smelled faintly of polish and old wood, unchanged since his youth. Somewhere deeper inside, his father was waiting, or perhaps not waiting at all, merely informed that his son had arrived and would need to be received. Whatever the outcome, Harry knew there was no turning back now. The letter had been ignored. The call had gone unanswered. But here, in this moment, he had ensured that his request could no longer be an abstraction on a desk or a note in a briefing file. It was real. It was in the room with them. And soon, it would demand an answer. The moment Harry stepped inside the palace proper, the temperature seemed to change. It wasn't just the literal shift from the cool London air to the carefully climate-controlled halls. It was the weight of the place itself. The corridors, adorned with oil paintings of ancestors and grand tapestries, radiated a kind of silent authority. Every footstep on the polished marble echoed, a reminder that this was not simply a house, but the epicenter of an institution centuries in the making. Harry had walked these halls countless times as a boy and as a working royal. Then, they had been spaces of routine, a place where he'd dash from one engagement to the next, or pause to chat with staff who had known him since he was barely old enough to talk. Now, they felt different. Each familiar sight carried a faint undercurrent of distance, as though the palace itself were reminding him that he no longer belonged here. A steward in a tailored black suit appeared from a side hall and greeted him with a restrained politeness. There was no hint of surprise in his demeanor. Clearly, word of Harry's arrival had moved swiftly through the building. The steward gestured for Harry to follow and led him through a series of quieter corridors, avoiding the more public spaces where tourists and junior staff might glimpse him. This was the kind of discretion the palace excelled at, the ability to move someone from one point to another without a single unplanned pair of eyes catching sight. As they walked, Harry caught faint murmurs of conversation from behind closed doors, the shuffle of papers, the occasional metallic clink of a teacup being set down. The palace was a working machine, always in motion, yet somehow capable of absorbing the unexpected without outward disruption. The steward led him toward a smaller, less ornate reception room tucked away from the main ceremonial halls. It was a space often used for private meetings, formal enough to convey importance, but without the intimidating grandeur of the throne room or the state dining room. The room was warm, lit by soft lamps rather than the harsh overhead fixtures of some of the larger halls. Heavy curtains framed tall windows that looked out over the gardens, their winter bare branches swaying gently in the wind. On a polished mahogany table near the center of the room sat a discreet silver tray with 2 teacups, a small pot of Earl Grey, and a plate of shortbread biscuits, the kind of understated hospitality that said, without words, that the conversation to come was expected to be private but not necessarily comfortable. Harry was invited to sit, but he remained standing for a moment, his eyes scanning the room. It was quiet, save for the faint ticking of a clock on the mantel. In that silence, he felt the old mixture of familiarity and formality, the knowledge that, within these walls, every word, every gesture, was part of a larger narrative. Minutes passed before the door opened again, and in stepped one of the king's senior aides. The man's expression was professional but neutral, betraying nothing of the king's mood. He informed Harry that His Majesty was in a meeting but would join him shortly. Harry nodded, resisting the urge to ask how long shortly meant. In the palace, such words could cover anything from 5 minutes to an hour. As he waited, Harry found himself listening to the small sounds of the building, the faint creak of floorboards somewhere above, the distant chime of another clock down the corridor. He thought back to the letter, to the silence that had followed, and to the uncertainty of the last few weeks. Whatever else happened today, he needed, a clear answer. The door opened once more, and this time, a more familiar figure stepped in. It was not his father, but Sir Clive Alderton, the king's private secretary. Clive had known Harry for years and had been present during some of the most significant moments in the family's recent history. His presence here was telling. It meant that whatever conversation was about to take place, it was being treated as both personal and official business. Clive greeted Harry with a measured warmth, the kind that acknowledged their shared history without crossing into intimacy. He asked a few polite questions about Harry's flight, about Montecito, about the children. It was small talk, but it was also a way of gauging Harry's mood, testing the temperature before the main event. Harry answered in kind, keeping his tone neutral but not unfriendly. He knew that in palace culture, these moments of preamble could be as important as the discussion itself. They were a way of setting boundaries, signaling whether the meeting would be combative, conciliatory, or somewhere in between. After a few minutes, Clive glanced toward the door, as though listening for a cue. Then he straightened, smoothed his suit jacket, and said simply, "His Majesty will see you now." Harry felt his stomach tighten, though his expression remained steady. He followed Clive down a short corridor to another, even smaller room, one that Harry recognized instantly. It was a private audience chamber, a space designed for one-on-one conversations of significance. The furnishings were elegant but understated, a small writing desk, 2 armchairs, a low table with a single vase of fresh flowers. And there, standing by the window with his hands clasped loosely behind his back, was King Charles III. He turned at the sound of their approach, his expression composed but not unfriendly. For a brief moment, Harry saw not the monarch, but his father, older now, his hair whiter, his frame a little more stooped, but still the man who had once guided him through palace gardens as a boy. The door closed softly behind them, leaving the 2 men alone. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. The weight of years, of shared history, of estrangement, of unspoken grievances, hung in the air between them. Then Charles stepped forward, extended a hand, and said, "Harry." It was not cold, but it was not warm either. A single word, carrying both acknowledgement and distance. Harry shook his father's hand, meeting his eyes, and replied in kind, "Pa." In that moment, Harry knew that the reception had been carefully orchestrated to set a tone. It was not a hostile welcome, but it was one that reminded him he was entering the king's domain under the king's terms. Whatever came next would not be casual. It would be a negotiation, however much they might dress it in the language of family. And with that, they took their seats. The conversation, the one that would determine not only the outcome of Harry's visit but the shape of their relationship going forward, was about to begin. The first moments after they sat down were heavy with restraint. Harry could feel the distance in his father's posture, straight-backed, hands loosely clasped in his lap, the slight incline of his head that signaled polite attention but no readiness to yield. Charles had always been skilled at using silence as a tool. It forced others to speak first, to fill the void, to reveal their intentions without him having to ask. Harry recognized the tactic immediately. He had seen it work on ministers, foreign dignitaries, even other members of the family. But this wasn't a policy briefing or a ceremonial audience. This was personal, and Harry had no intention of being baited into over-explaining before he could even frame the conversation on his own terms. Still, the silence was pressing in, and after a few moments, he took a breath and spoke. "I appreciate you seeing me, Pa," he began, his tone steady but deliberate. "I know it wasn't scheduled, but I thought it was important we talk face-to-face. Letters and calls, they don't seem to be getting us very far." Charles's eyes held his, unreadable. "You have my attention," he replied evenly. "So, what is it you feel we must discuss in person?" Harry leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. He had rehearsed this part in his head for days. How to lay out the situation without sounding like he was pleading. How to convey urgency without sliding into desperation. It's no secret that Meghan and I have been working hard to build a life outside the institution. We've taken on projects, we've tried to make them work, and some of them have. But others, he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Others haven't gone as we'd hoped. There have been delays, changes. And in the meantime, there are obligations we can't just walk away from. Security, commitments to people who rely on us, the house. The costs don't stop, even when the income isn't steady. Charles's gaze didn't waver, but Harry thought he saw a faint tightening around his eyes. He knew his father well enough to recognize the signs of someone already framing a counterpoint. "I'm not here to ask for a handout," Harry continued, his voice firmer now. "I'm asking for some temporary support, just until the next round of projects is completed. It wouldn't be a gift, it wouldn't be permanent. Think of it as a bridge. Something to keep us steady while we finalize what we've already put into motion." There was a pause, and then Charles asked the question Harry had been expecting. "Why now? You've made it very clear in recent years that you wanted to be independent. You stepped away from your role, from the sovereign grant, from the structures that supported you. That was your choice. Why should I reverse course now?" The words were not unkind, but they were pointed, and they carried a deeper message. This was not just about money, but about precedent. Harry held his father's gaze. "Because things are different now. When we left, we had every reason to believe the deals we signed would keep us going for years. But the reality of working outside the institution is, it's unpredictable. One year you're at the center of public interest, the next, people move on. We're still working, we're still putting in the effort, but it's not the same as having the stability I had here." Charles's fingers tapped lightly against his knee, a subtle sign of impatience. "Do you understand the position you're asking me to put myself in? To the public, this would look as though the king is funding a couple who walked away from royal duties, who have, on more than one occasion, criticized this family in the most public of ways. If I do this for you, what message does that send to the press, to Parliament, to the rest of the family?" Harry could feel the shift in tone, the transition from personal father-son conversation to the language of a monarch weighing political implications. It made his chest tighten. He had known this was coming, but it still stung to hear the request reframed as a matter of optics rather than family. "I'm not asking for it to be public," Harry countered quickly. "No one outside of this room has to know. We can structure it privately, through whatever channels make sense. I'm not trying to put you in a difficult position politically. I'm asking for help as your son." The last words hung in the air, heavier than he intended. Charles's eyes softened for the briefest moment, but his voice remained steady. "I have always been willing to help my children when it was in their best interest," he said. "But helping you in this way, after everything, is not straightforward. It's not only about money. It's about trust. And Harry, you've put me in a position where trusting you is complicated." The sting of the remark was immediate. Harry knew what his father meant. The interviews, the memoir, the disclosures about private family matters. To Charles, those had not been just career moves. They were personal breaches, wounds still healing, if healing at all. "I know I've made choices you don't agree with," Harry admitted, his voice low. "And I know I've said things that hurt. But I've also tried to be honest. I've tried to tell my story. That's not the same as betrayal." Charles gave a small sigh, looking down at his hands. "Sometimes the line between the two is thinner than you think." The silence that followed was dense. Harry could feel the conversation sliding toward an impasse, the point where both men had said just enough to make the other dig in. He straightened in his seat. "So that's it. You're telling me no?" Charles looked at him evenly. I'm telling you that I cannot give you what you're asking for, not in the way you're asking for it. It would compromise more than you realize, and it would undo the principle you yourself insisted upon when you left, that you would be financially independent. Harry's jaw tightened, his pulse quickening. He had come thousands of miles, rehearsed every word, endured the unease of walking back into this building. All for this. Independence isn't supposed to mean isolation, Harry said sharply. And it's not supposed to mean that family turns its back when things get hard. Charles's voice remained calm, but there was a finality in it now. Independence means standing on your own feet, Harry. And you can. You've chosen a path that comes with risks. This is one of them. The words landed with the weight of a door closing. Harry leaned back in his chair, feeling the fight go out of him, replaced by something colder. There was no point pushing further. The answer had been given. When they stood, Charles extended his hand again. Harry took it, but this time the grip was brief, perfunctory. They exchanged no more than a polite nod before the door opened, and the King's aide stepped back in, ready to escort Harry out. As he walked back through the corridors toward the palace exit, the grandeur around him felt less like history and more like distance. Centuries of tradition closing ranks against him. Whatever he had hoped to achieve in that room